Everyone. Thank you, Jennifer, for being here. And I think we will start with the beginning, asking Jennifer to introduce herself, and then we will explore more on her expertise and what she's bringing to the table for our therapist and creative arts therapist.
Okay. Well, I'm Jennifer Albright Knash. I'm a doctor of art therapy, an art therapist, and a licensed counselor. And I would say that the journey with art therapy for me started in about eighth grade. I had an amazing art instructor who really kind of guided me through middle school and then up. I had her up until my senior year. And she pushed me really hard to connect with art, to find experiences that I think, were challenging for me. And also, I grew up in the South and really in the city that I was in, 20 plus years ago, art therapy was not really a thing. There weren't any art therapists in the city. And so, she talked to me a little bit about what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I said, I just want to be able to work with people and help people and do art. And she was like, okay, well, you want to be an art therapist. I don't know how she had connected with that, but from that point on, I really had the idea that made sense to me. But I think, like many art therapists, my path was kind of windy. It wasn't direct. I feel like the road drawing assessment is like such a great way to actually even look at my trajectory, like through art therapy and getting there. But one of the things that I really found is that my undergraduate education, as good as it was, I started out with a dual major in psychology and art, and I found that the psychology portion of it was very, very like dry, didactic. There was nothing experiential about it, and it was all about diagnosis and theories. And so that was not really feeding my soul. Like, this is not what I want to do, I don't think. So I ended up
Yeah.
dropping the psychology major. And then the art classes were not expressive. It was also very theoretical. And so I actually ended up as an English major but still knew at some point I wanted to connect back to art therapy. So a few years later, I ended up moving to Santa Fe, I guess I was working in a gallery and just kind of, you know, doing what I could do with an English major at that point. I taught high school for a little bit. And ended up, I was driving down the road and listening to the radio, and there was actually a commercial for the graduate school that I attended, which was Southwestern. And I went and talked to the admissions person, and like 3 weeks later, I started school. It was just kind of
Wow.
a blend experience. Um, but with that, I have been incredibly lucky that I've had these amazing art therapy mentors in my life. Deb Schroeder was, I was there the first year she came in and taught, and Kate Rogers. And then, later on, when I went for my doctorate at Mount Mary, I had Bruce Moon and Lynn Capitan as my as two of the people that taught me and also were on my committee for my dissertation. And so with that, I feel like I just have really been blessed with, like, I think I should call them like fairy godparents, perhaps, instead of mentors, because that's really what they've been.
Yeah.
Um,
They
yeah.
were really good mentors, and I think they made the history of art therapy actually. Like I'm thinking those big names are still references for everyone who writes research projects. So wonderful.
Yeah, actually, I was stepping into a research class this morning, and we were talking about Lynn's book, and I think just the clarity and the excitement she wrote about research. She takes a topic that some people could find a little distancing or not all that exciting, and then made it like really rich and inviting. And I think having, the direction, one of the reasons that I really wanted the doctorate is that I had all these ideas, and from clinical practice, I'd seen things that had worked well, but I didn't feel like I had um, the ability to verbalize what it was that was happening and to explain to other professionals that were not art therapists, like the power of what was occurring and the healing processes that I was seeing. So it became really important to me to be able to write about this and to try to make it in a way that I think connects like science, the science portion and the magic portion of art therapy like together. And with, I think, Bruce and Lynn's direction, I was really able to kind of work backwards, where it's
Mhm.
like I knew in my gut why it worked, and then now let's actually reason it out so that there's some sustainable kind of information and evidence as to why my gut might be on target about some of these things. So.
Jennifer, I think without wanting to cut your story at that so beautifully waved with some wonderful mentors and your passion for explaining why art therapy works and what you found in the clinical work really translated into research so it will stay for future therapists of all kinds. Um, I think I connect so much with, and I was listening to another art therapist and researcher saying the same thing. Like I experienced in my clinical work something, and it was my gut feeling, but I wanted to say it in a way that is scientific and will touch the community. And it's so hard to translate actually what we feel in the clinic. We know that art therapy works. Like I think any creative arts therapy professional knows that arts therapies in general work. Now it's harder to explain to the public or to other professionals why and how it works. And I
Mhm.
think this is where we kind of get a little bit in difficulty because, like, how do you do research for something that is so subtle, so discreet, but I don't know, it's such a process that you cannot really qual quantify. So
Mhm.
how was for you that? How did you transfer this clinical work into research and taking as basis a lot of bits of research that already happened?
I think that was probably the hardest thing that I encountered, when I started to actually do the research process, and then also kind of unpacking, I think, the amount of clinical work that I've done, and trying to kind of take sort of the processes that I already knew, and then figuring out like how do you actually translate this and not lose like the experience of it. And so I decided with the research I was doing, I mean, I think with, so many times we look at our research studies with art therapy, and there's this struggle of like, okay, there's a sample size of like 3 or 4 people, or there's and so anyone else like perhaps in a more, I guess, rigid research kind of structure would look at that and be kind of doubtful as far as the sample size goes. And, we've also kind of some of the issues with like having actual cultural responsiveness in research. Um, for me, it was really important to combine sort of this idea of case study and what I was seeing in the sessions that I did for the research, but also putting it in the backdrop of the neurosequential model of therapeutics and like the assessments that were done through that. And so, it was helpful to take something that actually was a lot more I think, I guess, rooted in sort of neuroscience and have that be the framework. It also, I think at that time, I had not really integrated the expressive therapies continuum like into the process. It was more um, utilizing the four functional domains that Bruce Perry talks about, and thinking about, like, what is this doing for sensory integration? What is this doing for emotional regulation? Like, how does it build relational capacity? How does it connect to executive functioning? And taking those things and then combining sort of the magic of what was happening in the session, like those things seemed easy to kind of look at in that process. And also thinking about like what is actually going to help with sustainable trauma repair. Because we know this is, in my mind, I think in Bruce Perry's mind, and most people working with cumulative trauma or complex trauma, it is not a quick fix. Like this is something that takes like time. And unfortunately, so much of our economic system is about like, okay, you get, 6 to 8 sessions to work this through, or, it's like you have to get very creative in the ways that you work. And I think that was another reason the research and doing the work was so important to me, was to kind of show the need for some time and some slowness and some pacing. I think I went on kind of a whirlwind there, but it was very hard. I think consolidating. I remember working on the research problem for probably like 20 weeks of classes because it was so hard to get it refined enough to know that you're actually measuring something.
Mhm. I think that's a tricky part with what we measure actually in arts therapies, and how to measure things that are so delicate, so artistic, so metaphorical, so symbolic. But let's go back into how did you how did you arrive to connect with Bruce Perry's work actually? What is neurosequential for those who don't know yet what it is, because it's so ingrained in neuroscience and um, uh, may not be known by all the other therapists. So
Sure. I think one of the first classes I had at Mount Mary, somebody was like, "Have you read The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog?" And I'd read a lot of trauma literature, and that was, that had not been kind of in my wheelhouse of things. And so I started reading it, and that book really is built on case studies. And I think that that is sort of the power of Perry's writing. I mean, he has really worked hard to make something so complex feel accessible to people, and really taking like the ACEs study and those those foundational aspects of connecting trauma to these long-term um, just incredibly powerfully hard effects of between health and mental health and addiction and just so many different aspects. And so I think reading that book, in particular, there's a story about the kiddos that survived the Waco experience. And in reading that, like the kids were actually doing drawings that were explaining what was going to happen and what they'd experienced. And reading that chapter, I was like, okay, this totally makes sense. But my first question was like, where are the art therapists? I don't see the art therapists in this chapter. Like, what's going on? And so as I started to read, I also realized that there was a flagship institution for Bruce Perry's theories in Milwaukee at that time. And so I actually reached out to them. I reached out to Bruce Perry to talk a bit about the kind of the process that was going on there and if there would be room to do research. Perry was incredibly gracious and offered a conversation, and I did some presenting with him in Canada, and it was just pretty amazing as far as how gracious he was. Um, and I think that, you know, looking at what he wrote, there are parts, the like the neurosequential model talking about, how the brain develops and sequence, how different parts of the brain respond to sort of, I don't ever like the word triggers necessarily, but like, to
Stimuli.
stimulate. Yeah. I think that, he was one of the first people that really wrote incredibly well and clearly about these things. And so I really became kind of fangirlish around the whole Bruce Perry experience, and then was like, well, this will fit in so well with actually what I am trying to do. Because there was this argument, really, I mean, and I've seen it so many times in treatment facilities and places that I've worked, IOPs, where the first thing we do for people in treatment that have experienced trauma is to, one, put them in a group setting, which is often the most frightening thing that you can do. Two, we give them worksheets or handouts or cognitive behavioral interventions. And it's not those are great. It's just that the order of these things sometimes are really off. Because we're asking people to do things that are highly cognitive when they're not even in their bodies. They're not even able to regulate. And when someone's dysregulated, asking them to use executive functioning when they're still like in fight, flight, freeze, all over the place, it's really just kind of out of order. And I could not get that point across. Like I was working with kids and teachers, parents could not understand why the kid could not sit still in class for, 8 hours, or people who couldn't sit at work for 8 hours because their nervous systems were all over the place. And so I think doing this research, it was really helpful for me to actually be able to explain in a clearer way, like, we're asking people to do something way above their capacity, their level of functioning right now.
And probably not necessarily that they are not capable of functioning at higher levels. It's just when you're in really high stress response, your mind is hijacked and none of the executive functionings are working.
Exactly.
You cannot demand any of those.
Mhm.
Um, how then? You were also talking about using ATC, expressive therapies continue. How are they matching together? Um,
Well, I think some people would argue that they don't, and that's okay. I think for me, it kind of came together rather seamlessly. And the reason, um, like I was noticing, I was working with a uh, a kid who they were saying like he was developmentally not able to do schoolwork at a certain level, and then he was way below his level on intelligence. And I was not seeing that. But part of the reason that I wasn't seeing that is because he would come into session, we would do something that was like very much on the kinesthetic and sensory part of the ETC. All of a sudden, he would start to kind of move into the perceptive and affective and like be able to kind of note his emotional state and express it through the artwork. And then the next thing I know, he was connecting to metaphor and symbolism. And those are very high up on the cognitive functioning chain. And, to say, well, this kiddo doesn't have the ability, he did have the ability. He couldn't do it, though. He couldn't access that without being grounded first and kind of call these, I guess, lower level. But I think it's really more about, really being rooted and feeling resourced. And once it was kind of clear to me that if you got him resource that he could learn, all of a sudden things started to shift for him. Like he was being able to take things in class and um, do things that were, I mean, not at all above his capacity. It was simply just connecting those things again. Yeah. So it was
Yeah.
coming naturally. Like, I'm sorry, it was just kind of a learning process of seeing it happen, and once I was seeing it and recognizing it in the moment, I'm like, this is absolutely what's happening on the ATC, and this is corresponding with kind of these four functional domains. And they're definitely not linear, they definitely are more circular because we may be in several areas at simultaneously. In fact, kind of I hope we are most of the time. Um, but and until like kind of some of the the grounding activities were sort of integrated, I just don't think the other things were easy to get to.
So I'm picking on the fact that both the neurosequential model and the ETC model actually bring a sort of sensory kinesthetic regulation, integration to be
Mhm.
able to access higher functioning, maybe. And from what I'm hearing, such a beautiful case study about this integration and the fact that if the child can integrate those difficult sensations and understand them, well, he's very well capable to function at the level that the school needs. And it's very cognitive, actually, and sometimes it's too cognitive for kids.
I would agree with that. I was one of those kids that if I
Me
wasn't
too.
doing nothing was going into my brain. And I can't tell you how many times I got in trouble for doodling in class. And I was like, well, I cannot hear you if I'm not doodling. Like it just doesn't happen. So yeah, I was always defending those kids when they were like, well, they're drawing all over their notebook. Yeah, they are. That's actually great.
Yeah,
Have them.
I was one of them.
Yes. They're not throwing chairs. Be excited about that part. So.
Yeah, I think that's how my parents actually realized that, oh, maybe she's talented because they took my notebooks and all of them, instead of having only notes, they had drawings everywhere plus a little bit of notes. So yeah, I think if we're allowed, we can get even as children this capacity to soothe ourselves, soothe our senses, and then be able to function cognitively as the school requires. Um,
Yeah.
I'm coming back to your research, and first, I'm very intrigued of the title Cumulative Trauma Repair. Uh, what is that about?
Um, well, I think, it would be lovely if we could say cumulative trauma cure, but
Okay.
uh, I have yet to really, have the ability or see like the magic wand approach. And um, one of the things that Bruce Perry talks about is he actually talks about dosing, where it's like you do doses of things. Like when he's talking about building relational capacity, that it's about like with individuals that especially have had relational trauma, bringing in like one trusted other person first and trying to build trust, there, and then maybe adding in like one or two other people and slowly building trust that way. And then maybe you add them to a little bit larger group. But I think that, very often the way treatment is built is like that's not really economically um, attractive because it takes time and more staff and energy. Um, but I think again, it's the sort of pacing of recovery and repair. And when I think about, I think the reason I like the word cumulative maybe more than complex or like, some of the other terms is that um, I have yet to really experience someone who was like, I had this one trauma incident. That was it. I've never had another one. And so, um, it's I do think we have people that they're, maybe the presenting problem is a big event. But when we kind of go back and start to track things, there's layers. And so for me, cumulative really feels like it's kind of these layers of experiences that are now causing a person to have a very hard time responding to um, stimuli, whether it's benign or if it's, something that really truly is a danger or harmful. All of it gets kind of the same response. And so when I think about repair, the first thing I think about is kind of helping people get back into their window of tolerance. And, I think sometimes we think of window of tolerance and we think that people need to remain calm and regulated all the time. That is not what that means. Like it's simply that we have our ups and downs. We have big emotional responses. Those are okay to have. It's
Oh, 1 second. I think it was
okay.
muting by mistake.
Okay. She's like, I'm done with this topic. So I think it's more oh gosh, what was I saying? Okay, so I think it really truly is about helping people not go into like the hypervigilance or the dissociation, like this collapses, but instead getting into a place where they're more aware and feel like they have um, probably more proactive tools and approaches to when things do kind of go awry. In their lives or there are external kind of stressors that there's the ability to respond differently. I think the other thing is that reconnection to creativity, to joy, to imagination. Like that's the biggest thing for me. Because after kind of years of doing this and having experiences of my own, that definitely qualify with cumulative trauma, it is really hard to engage with, I think, things like hope and things like joy and things like creativity and imagination when you are just surviving and really doing your best to just survive. And those are really luxurious kind of things. And so when I see people getting to a place where they're able to reconnect with those, I know there's some repair happening. And again, that's another thing of like, how do we measure imagination? How do we measure like this, that? I don't know. It's definitely a gut intuitive piece when I notice somebody being able to connect with that. I'm like kind of able to experience it with them and note that there's something really beautiful occurring. So
I think I will come back to the neurosequential model actually that you use in your research and practice, I imagine. And also notice that from what I know and from what I read from neuroscience, when you're in states of hope, creativity, imagination, curiosity, you're actually at very high level of functioning, and you're not in the stress response. You're not in the hypovigilance. You are actually in the window of tolerance, or however we want to call it. Um, and it feels that we're on one way or another coming back to that window of the tolerance that could be called window of capacity. I know Kari Malchiori calls it window of capacity or windows of safety, or we can call it however we want, but I think it's the part where our um, senses are not overwhelmed or totally withdrawn, and we just cannot function in that state.
yeah, another term for it is the optimal arousal zone. The
You
O.
see, yeah, I didn't know about this term, so I think many would use this these different terms that are very similar, have the same flavor.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think, um, I think at one point in time, trauma work was about these big cathartic moments that maybe took people way out of the window of tolerance. And I know there are some practitioners that still really feel like that's beneficial. Um, I think just it may be a comfort level thing, but it's also something that I've seen where I've seen people go into that catharsis, have those big moments, and then actually not be able to recuperate very well after the fact. Or it takes longer to kind of come back. Um, I've also seen people get like very reliant on those cathartic moments as it could, and thinking that like work isn't happening if I'm not having this big, huge thing. And I I really feel like slow and gentle tends to be, I mean, at least my pacing. And I think um, especially with individuals that do have layers of trauma, the importance of pacing, um, and not getting ahead of their process. And I think the other thing that can happen too is in those cathartic moments, people kind of lose track of where they are and may not be in their body as much. They also, I think it's one of those informed consent pieces too. Like, are we really preparing somebody that they're going to go that far or that deep that quickly? And if we're not, then I always worry about people when they get home. Like, how do they feel after they've been through all that? And especially going home, processing it all and not having adequate support. It may be different in a residential treatment or something, but um, I don't know. I think there's a number of people that have actually kind of shifted more in the slower direction. Like I love Tion Dayton's work and her work on like relational trauma and working with that. And it seems to me like she's really slowed down her pacing also kind of in the psychodrama and the way that she works too.
And what could be ways you were talking about slowing down? And I think that's something that we hear everywhere. Slow down, but we cannot slow down actually. Not even us as therapists. It's very hard to slow down when the society imposed a certain rhythm, a certain amount of, I don't know, a certain budget, a certain, I don't know, rhythm of living. How do we slow down? What do you suggest to kind of repair, heal this cumulative trauma? What did you
Well,
find in your research actually?
I mean, because I didn't get a ton of time actually with those individuals, but I did see progress, and I think, well, like for one example, one thing that I saw with like the same kiddo that I was talking about, he started to draw like outside of our session and actually found that he was a pretty good artist. And so he was actually, the feedback, he was bullied horribly by his peers a lot of the time. He was a kiddo that was kind of seen as like somewhat awkward. He had grown really fast, and so like his body, he was super tall, and like, I think he just got teased a lot. But people were looking at his art and they were like, that's actually pretty good. And it was one way that he was getting some positive feedback from peers and from other people kind of in the residential facility. And so he was carrying this notebook around all the time with his artwork. And it became this thing of like, if we hand people tools that they can take for themselves, because I don't get forever to work with people. I do have the luxury sometimes of getting longer amounts of time, but um, I think we have to like prepare them, like give them sort of this. oh, toolkit, our first aid kit is what I often call it, like, but like a mental one, um, where they can replicate these things for themselves. Like if it's, sometimes tracking is helpful. There's a million apps that are great, like, equipping people with really practical tools that they can do on their own outside of session is really important. I don't want somebody to be reliant on me forever. And, so I actually start from day one of having people in sessions where I give homework. Um, and generally it may be like just something really simple, but I have like those little somatic tools that can be used that are so helpful. I know like one that is super easy is the using your feet like cat paws, and you crunch one and then, crunch the other one like you can do it in your shoes, you can do it on the floor, however. I use it in meetings all the time if I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh my gosh, I am totally like not feeling grounded in this, and really pacing your breathing with the movement, but doing things where you're using both sides of the body really helps with regulation. And so, that's something that I might teach right away. Um, and I think, I can't tell you how many people I send home like with a baggie of Model Magic or something that, they can just keep using throughout the week. I love things like Wreck This Journal for kids. Like I think they sell them super cheap on Amazon, but those are things that, parents can do with kids. Actually, adults really should be doing Wreck This Journal a lot more because it brings in playfulness and just kind of like goofy ways of being creative, but taking out the perfection part of it. I've also had people keep scribble journals where they scribble every day and then try to find something in it and then write like one word about it, just something really simple where they're doing something regulatory at home. So,
Wonderful. It feels that those are grounding techniques, and bringing them back into present. From what I'm hearing, is more being the present. Learn to be in the present. Learn to be here. Connect
mm,
to the present. I'm wondering, Jennifer, and I don't want to step too much aside of our discussion. I'm wondering, how is your training in, is it in yoga therapy, if I'm not mistaken? How is this also helping the whole image? Because I guess it does.
it does. It's funny. I don't use yoga a ton in sessions. But I do think like the movements that I've learned and the breathing in particular has been really helpful. I'm actually after this, I've signed up. I don't have time to do this, but I signed up for a trauma informed yoga teaching class. Just because I kind of wanted to connect that a little bit more directly. But I do think that I am one of these people, you ask me to meditate and good luck. Like my head cannot do it. I have monkey brain so badly, and and it's hard. Like the generally the um other people that I often work with are like, "Oh, if you just meditate. If I meditate, you will have to like peel me off the ceiling. I cannot do it." And so I know though if I'm moving and breathing, I can. Like I can get very like kind of solid in my body. But if I'm not doing something where I'm having to think about something else, it does not work for me. And so I think that's also something that I've kind of seen with clients, like, legs up the wall is really hugely helpful with yoga, or um, even doing like a child's pose or just very simple movement can really help, like just with getting still. Um, and noticing subtle differences in the body, like, thinking about, um, just with child's pose, if you're doing like the non-active one versus like active with the arms in front of you, there's a huge difference, I think, in the sensations, the way it feels, like what happens in your body and your brain as you do that. And having people just notice, like, what does it feel like when your body is doing this versus this? Because if we've had a lot of trauma in our bodies and our body holds a lot, the last place we want to be is actually in our body and connected to it. And so, kind of coming back to that in subtle ways, I think it can be incredibly helpful. And then, pairing it with artwork, I think too, like doing movements, pairing, working with oscillation and pendulation kind of between resources and things that might be slightly more challenging and kind of having those to swing back and forth between. Um, Again, I think that kind of widens that window of tolerance a little bit. It allows for a little more, um, I don't want to say distress, but I guess it is, creating tolerance for distress and creating a bit more acceptance for things that are not going perfectly. Um, just with
Yeah.
kind of yeah.
I don't know why it came this image that before, like 10, 20 years ago, um, we were so tempted to um, heal or deal with trauma in therapy through talking about trauma, and then now I'm sensing so much in almost opposite direction, like don't talk about trauma when it's not healed somatically or when you don't integrate it because it will be re-traumatizing you. And I'm really glad that actually this new approach is coming into place and replacing the old approach that was kind of scary for me. And I think both the ETC and neurosequential model that Prosperi put into place, conceptualized, are very much into that, moving into more somatic, lower parts of the triangle for those who know the triangle of the Bruce Perry's triangle. Then if you're capable and you're regulated, you can move forwards, you can move down, and that's always a slide, and ETC is practically almost the same. And I think Via Lusenbrink even wrote a paper around um, neurosequential model in art therapy, and then she created also ETC. So maybe there is a connection that you're seeing there that's stronger than we think.
Yeah, and I think, Peggy Kolodny wrote a chapter too about connecting these and I think I think the other thing is like very often I have individuals when they come in to therapy, like they feel like they need to um tell you everything that's ever happened to them because that's kind of the way that they've
One, two,
seen
three, go.
It's a father, my mom. Look at this.
Like,
they've seen movies or what, like they've seen therapy presented where it's like, no, you have to drop everything and get completely honest, about this, or you don't get the benefits. And I find myself often kind of going, we will get to it. Like, let's just kind of slow it down a little bit. Or if it really feels like somebody needs to say it, absolutely giving them that ability, but then recognizing that often when people are kind of telling that story, they may not be entirely in their bodies as they're saying it. And so, and that's okay. I think that the telling of the story can be important. Sometimes it is powerful, but I also, I love narrative therapy and the idea that, okay, what if we take the story that you've, kind of said and you've told And what happens if we offer like some additional parts to the story, or we, add another chapter, or, what would have happened if something different had occurred during that time. So I think, the story can be important. I just feel like it's it's a combination. Like you can't just have the story. I think you have to have like these other components. And I do know that repair can happen without ever saying the story at all. Because it is on such a felt sense, like that that often like we can get places without the story being told.
Yeah, I agree. It happened, and probably our participant can testimony as well for stories that of clients who didn't really need to say it out loud, or to say it just bits of it and then push it back into a certain box, safety box, and then working on something else, and then it comes back and then put it again into the safety box, because it may be very difficult to express things that are not healed yet. I'm always saying to my own clients, when you're able to say it without huge emotion happening in your body, what that means is healed. When you're not able to say it, there's still a road there. There's still a path to be taken until it's healed.
Well, and I think that that's one of the concerns that I've had actually in previous therapeutic models, and even our therapy at times has been used almost as exposure therapy. I think that the kind of, you know, especially like you know, I worked with a therapist at one point, and we were colleagues where they were having the person draw the traumatic experience and then processing through the artwork, and it was sort of like, whoa, okay, I understand that, but where are you doing resource images, or like how are you getting to this? Like, um and I think even being careful with the idea of safety, because some people don't actually have a definition of safety or what safe feels like for them. And so really kind of coming into, asking, I think sometimes when we do the like, so can you draw a safe place when you're working with somebody who has been highly traumatized, it's, sometimes the answer is no. I don't know what that looks like. So it's sort of like, okay, so let's think about things that you might like. Like, let's collage things that you like. Just start with that. And then kind of start to think about like, so what are some of these things that you connect with? Is there anything we might want to work with just slowly to kind of start building it into these ideas? Or maybe wherever this place is that doesn't feel like there's as much pain there, can we start to access it? Um, so I think, it's also so individualized. This is why research is tricky, because every single person, one of the questions that I got asked was like, oh, are you doing a manual? Are you doing this in some sort of order where like you're going to start with this thing and do this next thing? So it's all kind of, there's this, are you creating a framework? And I'm like, no, I'm doing none of those things, because when every single person I work with, it is so intuitive as to perhaps what they need that day. And what they need that day, like if I have something else planned in my head, it may not be what they need. It's really about meeting the client where they're at that moment, and then providing them like with the tools, and having it truly be a collaborative process. Um,
Yeah,
so yeah.
especially I would say before ending and allowing questions, we're really curious. I would say that when somebody is so much in the hypervigilance and looking for cues from therapists, if therapists will come just with a no brain intervention, it will feel so off. It will feel not for them, and maybe even distancing them from therapy because it's not what they need.
Yeah. Again, I think it absolutely depends. And I know, I have this little kiddo that I'm working with right now who absolutely cracks me up like every time he comes in session because he will he'll pick one thing, and then he sort of has like a backup plan all the time. And it's nothing that I have devised. It's just like his thing. And he'll dip into something. And this is all intuitive on his part. This is nothing that I'm doing. He'll dip into something hard, and then immediately like pulls himself back out and does like a dance or sings a song or like last time he was like, can we do clay, and his body knows what to ask for. It is amazing. And I love it when I'm working with clients and their bodies start to tell them what they need again, and um honestly, it's like that's the best time to be a therapist when I'm not having to direct. I'm just offering things and perhaps offering choice, but really allowing the client to drive it. Because we do have our own medicine. It's just a matter of tapping into it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. I think I bombarded you with so many questions, but we will like everyone to bombard you with questions and start actually a discussion from therapist to therapist. We're here at really community dialogue, so feel free to share your own story or ask Jennifer questions. Um, you will not be on the recording. It's only your voice that will be on the recording. So don't worry at all. Allow yourself to ask questions and to share your own practice, your own experience.
I'll share or ask or talk.
Go
I
ahead.
really appreciate listening to this conversation. So I'm a graduate student in art therapy, and that's how I know actually Jennifer through the program. And so I don't have any necessarily clinical experience, only my own research and understanding, especially when it comes to complex trauma. And I love this phrase, cumulative trauma, because it does make sense how everything is layered and also how fragmented some of those memories can be too. So people may not be able to even access the complete memory if they wanted to. And I'm thinking about, that is there a choice about accessing it? Is it just not accessible? And then there's all these protective aspects too that are trying to keep us like we sometimes we have those walls for a reason because that material is really challenging. And I'm not as familiar with the neurosequential model, but I'm very interested in this, and I'm excited to dive into Jennifer's book. So I apologize that I'm not totally informed about this coming into this. But one thing this has reminded me of is that, even thinking about internal family systems and how, in my experience, how challenging that can be because it's wanting to say, like, okay, you're going to connect your cognitive piece, and you're going to speak to those parts inside of you. And so, but when the trauma is up, our memories are up, it is really impossible to access that. And so, and that's at least in my experience. And I know that IFS is something that is recommended for like trauma work, but I think the model of the ETC and understanding where the person is at. But if you're having, you know, struggles with, like memory or PTSD or flashbacks, like that's not the time to try and get someone into that stage. And this conversation about, like jumping in on the kinesthetic or monkey brain and not being able to focus, it's making things come a lot more clear. So I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
you.
I'm actually really glad you brought in internal family systems. I love internal family systems. I think that you're right, though. Sometimes I've noticed, like, even myself trying to go into that place, I start to feel silly, or if I wonder if I'm just making things up. And I think, but I do think that the protectors there are hugely helpful, if we can access them. And there have been several things written as far as somatic internal family systems, as well as art therapy and internal family systems. And I would really like to see more of that crossover, because I think what that does, with art therapy, at least, it externalizes, the kind of this internal constellation, so that there can be more interaction that way, if it's hard to kind of go have that sort of a reflexive, like, interior sort of thing happening. And Schwartz really started with kind of, there was the chapter that he wrote about having like this whole line of chairs because he was doing it in Gestalt fashion. And that it got silly because it was like there's a circle of chairs and he was moving them in and out. And actually a client said, hey, we could probably do it without all these chairs. But thinking about the empty chair technique, and I think with utilizing art therapy, where we're having conversations with, like, kind of doing an internal genogram of sorts, or, really bringing that out, can be incredibly powerful. I do think, though, part of the reason that that works, or the somatic might work, is that you're integrating that grounding process to begin with like the drawing process, or however you're going to do it, and then moving into the symbols. Um, but yeah, I do think it does take, I think it takes some higher level functioning to be able to go inside like that, and have it actually come out in a way that, I think that makes sense. But I mean, I've seen Richard Schwartz do it effortlessly, though. I don't know that I would be able to practice it to that extent. So, yeah.
And I don't want to, I'm not like downplaying IFS at all, because I think in like certain regulated states, and maybe there's a connection between like the neurosequential, like where you're at, and also like what are you actually capable of processing in that moment. And so, because the somatic, I think, is so powerful of just feeling. And then an ETC, I think, can come in as well with the movement, because, sometimes we're finishing those moments where, there has been stuckness. And so movement and drawing and coming up with resolution, like that's a way to kind of complete that cycle from my understanding. So, but I'm still a novice. I'm still trying to figure it out, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
I like the way you put that, as far as kind of closing the circle a bit. Yeah, nice.
I'm inviting for more questions. And don't forget also, if you're a creative arts therapist, maybe you can even draw or work on something create something during our discussion. Don't feel that we need to really watch this and not do anything. I think we're more in the movement. We're more in the creation. That's why we're here. So so feel free.
If there aren't any questions right now, can I just ask a clarifying question? Can you just briefly kind of give a quick overview on the neurosequential model, if
Sure.
you don't mind?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things is that the sort of the start of this, really was thinking about the brain functioning, and like the way that the brain develops, and the order that the brain develops. And then I think the noticing of the impact that trauma has on brain development. And one of the things that Perry says a lot is that chronological age does not equal developmental age when trauma is involved. And so that we really have to pay attention to that. One of the things that I started kind of with, and one of the things that they were doing at the institution where I was, is they were using the assessment lens. So part of this was about, being able to assess people more accurately to really see what areas of the brain were perhaps underdeveloped or not as accessible due to some of the, you know, whatever was happening for the person. And so, the with Perry's work, he would actually create these brain maps that were very detailed of the areas that needed, I think, more attention. And it was really based on behavior. It was based on behaviors and outward kind of appearance. And one of the things that Perry talked about is like we need to actually be able to try to match this actually with brain scans and PET scans and things like that to kind of see how accurate this is, which is something that I think he's been in process with. But on top of that, what I love is he's talked about resiliency factors. And I think, now we probably talk more about protective factors just because resiliency is kind of gotten like some judgment, I think, attached to it. But thinking about protective factors and kind of measuring like how many protective factors were there, how many relational positive moments were there in contrast to possible events that would be considered traumatic. And that often what we see is that people who have had a number of protective factors, it creates some sort of barrier from some of the adverse effects from trauma. And so that was one of the things he was measuring. And then, also in where in the development did these different things happen? Like he's had all these different ways of assessing. And part of the issue with this is that the assessment itself cost a lot of money because you have to have someone who is trained in NMT, which is it's quite a long process and an expensive one. And then in order to do these interviews and to get all the information, like often, if he was starting with kids, these were kids that were often like in the foster system or, not with their, I guess, birth family. And so it was doing interviews with like birth family if they could get those people. It was also doing it with whoever the caregivers were, their teachers, like any therapists that were working with them to try to get as much of a like idea of what was being seen. And so I think that that's some of the complexity of the model. I mean, it was incredible, but it's also like kind of hard to track all these things. But when you look at the model itself, like with the four functional domains, to me, that's like the clearest part and kind of the part that I think connects the most with what I've done and what I see play out in therapy. And that really, as I said before, it starts with the sensory integration and then the emotional regulation. Next is building relational capacity. And then lastly is kind of hooking into the cognitive. But what I like is that I feel like that cognitive part really starts to fit in nicely with the symbolic um, part with the ETC, because I think that's where the bridge happens, is when we can start moving into symbolism and metaphor. Then we can really get into that creativity place too. So that's the I think for most art therapists, like that's the part that gets super exciting when somebody draws something or gets to something and they're like, oh, like that connects to this. And I think that's when you start to really like feel some movement. Um, Sorry, that was a long-winded kind of response to that, but
Thank you, Jennifer. And
Really wonderful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Margaret Minch. I have my master's in counseling. I'm in Pennsylvania in the US, and I'm working towards becoming a licensed professional counselor. Jennifer, I was just wondering if you could speak more about your thoughts on exposure therapy.
Well, I'll be careful where I tread with that. I think I think for some diagnoses, like when we're talking about like OCD or um there are some diagnoses that I can see benefit for as far as like, we're trying to get somebody to be able to do something that perhaps they have a phobia with, or that they're trying to get through a certain behavior. I think with exposure therapy, I know that there's a lot of places that use it, and a lot of places that swear by it. Um, I just know from my personal experience, I'm definitely not comfortable with it. And I think that part of the reason is that I'm not in the person's body. I don't know how much is too much. I can sense it, but just from a safety standpoint and a do no harm standpoint, I'm not comfortable with it. And I think though, one of the things, I guess one of the other issues with it, and concerns I have is that sometimes I think we ask people to tell the story like over and over again so they don't have an emotional connection to it. And to me, I'm wondering, are they just getting to a place where they can mask their feelings around it, or downplay like somatic responses because they feel like they're supposed to in order to please the therapist or, to accomplish some goal? Or is there really like repair happening around it? And I don't know. Um, yeah, do you have more questions about that, Margaret? I'm just curious. A great
Yeah,
question.
I was wondering, so you talked about the work between the therapist and the patient being collaborative. Is that something where like as a therapist, that you would ever have the patient tell you what they're experiencing in their body, or like if they're being exposed to something and it's too much for them? Like, I don't know if that's what I'm asking, or how do you see working with a patient as collaborative? Because I guess I'm usually thinking of it as the therapist is the one who's really responsible for how a session goes.
Mhm. And I think that we're responsible for holding the container of the session, and providing a safe container for people to be there. And you're right, we need to have a certain level of mastery about what we do, or else why would people come to us? You know? But I think on the flip side, the collaborative piece, like I very much believe one in collaborative treatment planning, where, I sit with a client, talk about, what they see as their goals. Like we kind of work together on like, what if we add this in, or would this be helpful? And kind of do like a give and take in that. So that already starts out with a process where they have input on their treatment goals and kind of their where they want to see the therapy going. And if they're in a place where they're like, I just don't know, I don't know, like then I kind of um and I will go back to the presenting problem and be like, well, it sounds like there's a lot of pain around this. Like, would you like to feel less pain? Like, is that something we want to do? And then think about like expressive ways that we can do that. But I think if you start with that direction, it helps with the collaboration. And then I think another thing is offering choice. So even if you're still like kind of directing the session, I think saying like, I'm wondering if either this would help or do you want to go down this road, and offering a couple things. And then that kind of allows for a little more choice and a little more collaboration. I like what you said about the idea of checking in with them around, if exposure is part of the protocol, or if that's like something that's widely done in the agency where you're at. Likert scales are great, like kind of saying like, where are you on this scale, like 1 to 5, or like picking the face, or whatever. Checking in with the body, going very, very slow. I think always having a resource though. So if you are asking somebody to dip into something that's harder to deal with, like where's the resource for them? Is it that, they have a pet that is really helpful, and as soon as they kind of call up even the idea of their pet, like that starts to regulate them? Or is it that there's like a certain smell that they really love, or using like the five senses, things like that. So you always have that balance. I mean, my fear is like when we jump into these things and we don't have a resource, that's where I feel like harm is really, really potentially there. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. That is helpful. Yeah.
I don't want to be the naysayer of exposure therapy. I think it's more of it's my cover level, so I'll just speak to that.
And it also feels, well, in a way, exposure could be many things, but it also feels a little bit far, I would say, from ETC and neurosequential. It's pushing the client in a way.
Mhm. It is. And I mean, I think the other thing too is there's never going to be a time where you have the ability to make everything completely safe for a client. There will be plenty of challenges in a session. And so I think with that, like whether it's advertent or inadvertent, as far as, or, and I don't know if advertent is even a word. I think I just made that up. But if it's intentional or not, I think, there's going to be times where something shows up that is problematic. And I think when those times happen, it's about like, okay, together, let's work on something that's going to help with grounding. Or you can come back from this. Like, let's figure out how to do that. And very often that's where repair happens. Um, I know Lisa Hines has just done this whole thing on repair and rupture and the therapeutic relationship. And it was really meaningful when I kind of saw that and she talked about it, because it's actually using aspects of the ETC to look at the relationship and how we do make repair when we have like overstepped on something, or, I mean, I've had times where something showed up in session and it was such a shock and a surprise. And it was like, okay, where I'm not sure. Like, what do we do with this? And even, I mean, I tend to be kind of honest. I'm definitely not one of those neutral therapists. Like, I'm like, oh, well, that just came into the room. What do we do with that? And but then offering some options at that point too. I don't want them to feel like they're out there trying to figure it out for me. But it's sort of that balance of like, I think choice is that kind of everything that I try to do with people. Yeah.
Yeah, wondering if there are more questions or sharing a story or anything that you can bring to the table. Let's not leave Jennifer alone to answer to questions. Let's be a community and answer to each other, maybe.
I'll just share a little bit more if that's okay. I hope you guys don't mind me coming back in. I just think it's such a fascinating process, especially at how we access memory, and that's something that I'm very interested in. My experience was I do relate to having cumulative trauma as well too. And my mom did this one thing that was so protective. She got me into drawing lessons with someone who taught the lessons from drawing from the right side of the brain. And so these exercises of learning how to tap into the right side of the brain, and then I'm reading different things about how trauma is stored in that area. And so what ended up happening for me is that drawing became a natural outlet for drawing my feelings, my emotions, my memories, like the fragments of the memories, without being able to fully understand what was happening. And I didn't have the support to process it, but it acted as a record and an outlet. So I just feel like art and creativity has such a potential for helping us understand the things that we cannot access cognitively. And I had a lot of repressed memories and they were really fragmented. So I think I'm resonating and I'm hoping that I can get to the place where I feel like I understand what this process is. But I want to say that I appreciate Jennifer you sharing about your story and also kind of wanting to understand like what is it that we're doing that's so powerful. And I feel like I still can't quite get my finger on it, but I'm open to like suggestions and places to look for research and for me I'm wanting to understand how memory works. But even with the ETC, I'm like, okay, I get it. Like the somatic, levels and stuff, the kinesthetic, we can access all those pieces, but how is it that we're able to access these memories specifically through art when we may not act, it comes later. But does that make sense? I don't know if
Does.
that makes sense.
Yeah, I think memory, especially with trauma, is such a tricky thing because I've seen, over the years, I've had such vastly different experiences with clients where either they tend to remember traumatic memories with this like crystal clear, like just like the smell, the sight, the like everything about it, like all the sensory pieces. But then they may have like blocks of time that surround the memory that are gone, or feel gone. And especially too, like I know I've asked the question before, like, can you tell me, what like say years 3 to 5 look like for you? And people are like, I don't remember anything from those times. I can't tell you anything about my childhood, where there's just chunks of time. Um, I think too, like there's other moments where the traumatic experience or traumatic process, because I mean sometimes it's like I think of neglect or like abusive experiences that are long term. It's like all of that seems gone, but the other memories are there, and so I think memory is fascinating, honestly. I think though, kind of like, when Margaret was bringing up this idea of exposure, like what sometimes happens, we don't realize when we are doing a piece of art or doing something that's very subtle, somebody may reconnect to something in their body and inadvertently we go to something that brings up a memory. Or maybe it's like I've had the experience of, I know I had like eucalyptus in my aroma thing, and I had somebody come in and immediately have a response to that. And a memory came back, and that was really hard. That was a big rupture. Like, I mean, it was certainly not something that I intended or, wanted to happen, but it was like it was a moment that recalled something that was so like hidden away in the brain. And it showed up and it came back in a very like somatic way. Um, but the client, we still work together. It was something that we moved through and were able to attend to and really resourced. And I do not keep eucalyptus in the office anymore, but it was definitely like, and I'm careful generally about having scents or things like that. But um, yeah, to me, memory is still such a, just a, it's, that is not my wheelhouse. Like, I think that's like a very kind of separate thing too, as far as really studying memory and the impact of trauma on memory. I think Bessel van der Kolk has done amazing writing around that, um, but yeah, I think I deal more with like kind of, um, the repair areas, and also like kind of when, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what to say on that one.
It's okay. It was more of just a sharing. And I think one thing that I'm getting from this is that even like it is a curiosity area for me, but the fact that there are, ways to work with what is there, regardless of understanding how the mechanism works, we don't necessarily have to. And I think that's what I'm hearing from your experience with the neurosequential model and the ETC, it's being able to recognize and be able to meet people where they're at and yeah, work with what you have. So yeah, yeah, I appreciate your thoughts though. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Jody Brown, and I'm sorry I came in late. I got the time change wrong. I'm here at Mount Mary. I'm a graduate student, and I've attended the World Art Therapy Conference for 3 years now as a student. And I've also worked with Melanie Heindel, who speaks very highly of you and has been talking to us about your book. And so I'm so excited that it's out and look forward to reading it. And I was so looking forward to today. Um, I'm in trauma right now. So I love this idea of what you're calling it as collective trauma instead of complex trauma. I also done some work with Megan Van Meter and attended her sessions. So I'm very familiar with the ETC and really glad that she presented at the conference. And so I'm very interested in this, kind of crossover between the ETC, which I love, and the neural sequential model. So is there any way, since I missed out in the beginning, is there like a summary or an overview or anything? I know that I believe that we're only here for a little while longer. So I don't know, I'm kind of coming in blind to this, but would love to talk with you and hear more and look forward to reading the book.
Thanks, Jody.
Yeah,
Melanie.
Jody, I think I will answer about this recording. As you see, it's recorded, and the recording will be on the site, so you could watch for 48 hours whatever you missed. And I'll let Jennifer to respond for the other parts.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I appreciate Melanie so much. She's pretty amazing. And we went through the same doctoral program and got the benefits of some of the Mount Mary, faculty and how wonderful they were. So I know you're in a great program. I taught there briefly too, so yeah. Yeah, and I think I am curious, like I know there are some people that are very like, ETC pure, but it only should be like utilized like for the certain thing. And then, I personally really see just kind of amazing room in this, and that the ETC is undertaught and underutilized in our therapy programs. And, one of the things that I've found is not all training programs bring it into, it really brings it in even. And so even finding faculty that feel really comfortable with teaching on the expressive therapies continuum can be a challenge. So yeah, thanks, Jody.
There's not much time left. Maybe one last question. Yes, Margaret.
Jennifer, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, you were talking about cumulative trauma repair, and you were talking about a client who's experienced a lot of trauma, and you bring one safe person in and then another, and it's a very slow process, and it's economically not practical because it takes so long. How, like, I guess in an ideal situation where economics wasn't a factor, like how long would you think this repair would be taking? Or I'm not sure how to express that.
I mean, again, I think it's really individualized. I know, like, oh my goodness, I had a kid that I worked with for several months, and all we did was sit on the floor and roll the ball back and forth. And because this kid, for one, he was not speaking, and he was, the things that he'd seen were pretty horrible as far as neglect. And I think his thought was like he would roll the ball to me and did not think that I was going to give it back to him or that I would do harm to him in some way or, and so that's what we did. And then we added in like, even kind of a game where I would have him name a food, once the ball came to him. And he did start to use words more at that point. But I think that that's kind of an example of like, honestly, with that kid, it would have been a very long process. Um, and, it started to be where I would bring in caregivers and have them do it with me. And then we, bring in siblings and their kiddos in the house. But I think for every person, it's going to be a different amount of time. And for every person, it's the different people will be safe, and so it's kind of this, if you don't have the luxury of that, one thing I suggest is really working on trauma-informed practices with group and, working on group norms and guidelines and really working on like what do you need to be able to be in this group and feel okay? What do you need from this? And then really working in grounding activities. And I think one thing I do is always provide a framework for a group so that we know how it's going to open and how it's going to close. So there's some predictability in there that kind of holds it as a container. Um, yeah.
I think we need to end, and I think I will want to end also with sharing probably the workshop that you will be having very soon. Give me 1 second. It's always so I'll just share just in case that anybody will be interested in 1 sec in Jennifer's workshop. I think it's very easy to access. You probably know already the www.artstherapies.org, and it will be there. So if ever you want to register, feel free. We'll put this information maybe on the site as well. Just not, I don't want to miss the opportunity to have everyone here to know about this. If you're interested to know more about theory and also do some experiential with Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that fun part.
Yeah, me too, actually. Let me put this in the chat as well, just in case. So we're ending here. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us, being a community. That's always fun to be together, and also it's a learning experience to know from therapists from everywhere in the world. So again, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. This was awesome.
Thank you, Carmen and Jennifer.
Thank you. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you both. I appreciate this so much. Have a good day.
Bye.